The image is burned into the collective memory of the 20th century. April 1975. A chaotic scramble on the rooftop of the American embassy in Saigon. Desperate Vietnamese civilians grasping at the skids of departing Huey helicopters, the wind whipping their clothes as the last vestiges of American power lifted into the sky, leaving behind a fractured country and a shattered illusion. For the US, the fall of Saigon was not merely a military defeat. It was a profound psychological trauma. The most powerful, heavily armed, technologically advanced, and economically dominant superpower in human history had been fought to a standstill and ultimately defeated by an unindustrialized, peasant-backed army in a nation the size of New Mexico. So here's the question nobody wants to actually sit with. If the US won almost every battle it fought, how did it lose the war? To understand how this happened, you have to understand what kind of war the US thought it had signed up for. After World War II, American strategy was built around a single idea: containment. Stop the spread of communism wherever it tries to expand before it can take root. This wasn't paranoia dreamed up in a vacuum. It followed the loss of China to Mao's communists in 1949 and the bloody stalemate in Korea just a few years later. By the time Vietnam split into a communist North and a Western-aligned South in 1954, Washington had already convinced itself of something called the domino theory. If South Vietnam fell to communism, Laos would follow, then Cambodia, then Thailand, and eventually the dominoes would topple all the way to Australia. This theory was wrong. We know that now with the benefit of history. Vietnam did not unify under communist rule in 1975, and the dominoes simply didn't fall the way policymakers predicted. Thailand stayed aligned with the West. Indonesia crushed its own communist movement in a bloodbath that had nothing to do with Vietnam. Here's where the story gets uncomfortable for the traditional narrative. American and South Vietnamese forces were tactically dominant for most of the war. US firepower, air superiority, and logistics were unmatched by anything North Vietnam or the Viet Cong could field. Body count estimates, however grim and however contested as a metric, consistently favored American and Allied forces by wide margins. Some historians estimate that North Vietnamese and Viet Cong combat deaths were 3 to 5 times higher than American and South Vietnamese losses throughout the war. So why didn't dominance translate into victory? Because North Vietnam wasn't playing the same game the US military was trained to play. North Vietnam's strategy understood something that American commanders were slow to accept. This wasn't a war meant to be won by grinding down the enemy's army on a map. It was a war of attrition against political will, specifically American political will, 7,000 miles away, sitting in living rooms watching the evening news. The Nord needed the war to become expensive and endless enough that the American public would eventually demand it stop. Every year the war dragged on without a clear, visible path to victory was a year that worked in Hanoi's favor, regardless of who won any individual firefight. Nowhere is this paradox clearer than in the Tet Offensive of January 1968. On paper, Tet was a disaster for the communists. Viet Cong forces launched coordinated surprise attacks across more than 100 cities and towns in South Vietnam simultaneously, including a dramatic assault on the US Embassy compound in Saigon itself. Within weeks, nearly every one of those attacks had been repelled. The Viet Cong as a fighting force was devastated, losing an estimated 40,000 to 50,000 fighters. It effectively ceased to exist as an independent, large-scale military organization for the rest of the war from that point on. North Vietnam's regular army had to carry most of the fighting itself. By any conventional military measurement, Tet was an overwhelming American and South Vietnamese victory. For years, American officials had been telling the public that the war was being won, that there was light at the end of the tunnel. Tet shattered that narrative instantly. If the enemy was on the verge of defeat, how were they capable of launching a coordinated nationwide surprise assault reaching all the way into the heart of the American embassy? The gap between what Americans had been told and what they saw on their television screens was the real casualty of Tet. Trust collapsed. Walter Cronkite, then the most trusted newsman in America, traveled to Vietnam and returned to tell his audience the war was, in his assessment, a stalemate. There's a strange irony buried in this. If North Vietnamese commanders had simply avoided a decisive confrontation and continued a slower guerrilla campaign, American public opinion might have eroded more gradually, without the singular shock event that crystallized doubt into a movement. Instead, the very act of trying to strike a knockout blow and failing to land it militarily became the moment that convinced millions of Americans the war could not be won. Wars are, in some sense, a contest of endurance, and the two sides in Vietnam were operating on wildly different clocks. For North Vietnam, this was an existential generational struggle for national unification. No election in Hanoi could remove the government from power if the war dragged on for another decade. Ho Chi Minh and his successors could, and did, plan in terms of decades. The US had no such luxury, structurally. American presidents faced re-election. American conscription pulled young men from every town in the country, and every flag-draped coffin arriving home was a data point the public could see and count. A democracy fighting a limited war for an ambiguous objective has an expiration date built into its own political system, whether or not its leaders admit it. There is another uncomfortable piece of the story that rarely gets its due weight: South Vietnam itself. America wasn't just fighting North Vietnam. It was trying to build an entire functioning state from the ground up, under fire, while that state's own leadership often prioritized personal and factional power over governing effectively. No amount of American firepower could manufacture the kind of grassroots political legitimacy that Ho Chi Minh's nationalist and communist movement had spent decades building. America didn't lose Vietnam because its military was defeated in the field. It lost because it entered a war intending to stop the spread of communism that was strategically oversized relative to what Vietnam actually threatened, fought that war using a strategy built for defeating armies rather than outlasting political will, and did so on a democratic timeline that could never match its opponent's willingness to fight for a generation if necessary. And it tied its fate to a South Vietnamese government that was never able to generate enough legitimacy to survive without direct American backing. In the end, Vietnam wasn't a lesson about the limits of American firepower. It was a lesson about the limits of fighting a war that the people paying for it with money and with their sons no longer believed in. And that's a lesson that didn't stay in the 1970s. Every American war since Vietnam, from Iraq to Afghanistan, has been shaped by the same central question military planners have never fully solved. You can win every battle and still lose the war. The Pentagon itself seemed to understand this. After Vietnam, US military doctrine underwent a deliberate transformation, sometimes called the Vietnam Syndrome, a newfound reluctance to commit American forces to open-ended conflicts without clear objectives, defined exit strategies, and overwhelming public support secured in advance. That doctrine held, imperfectly, for about a decade and a half. Then Iraq and Afghanistan proved that even institutional memory fades once the generation that lived through the original mistake retires. The United States once more found itself technically dominant on every battlefield in Afghanistan for 20 years, and once again withdrew from a capital, Kabul this time instead of Saigon, watching a government it had spent 2 decades and over $2 trillion building collapse within days of American forces leaving. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe.